Yeah, I think you're talking about Denton, and maybe that's a good place to start. What do you think were the factors in a jazz enclave forming away from both of the coasts? Like UNT became sort of a magnet all its own, where a bunch of great players came and went. And you would have expected that to come out of New York or New Orleans or maybe Chicago, but maybe you wouldn't expect it to come out of Denton, Texas. Like, to what do you attribute that?
The program, a man named Gene Hall, who was a very visionary music educator, uh, decided to start a program called Dance Band. And Gene, like I said, Gene was a really good educator and a good player too. And he put a dance band together that played at shows here at North Texas. And the union, or I don't know who sponsored it, but there was a band contest held at Roseland, former Roseland there in New York City. And I'll be darned if these kids from North Texas didn't go up there and blow everybody else away. So that was the beginning of its notoriety. And people like Jimmy Giuffre, who came there as well, was an early student, and Herb Ellis, the great guitarist. They came on because of the GI Bill. And quite frankly, the North Texas was the only school that was really teaching jazz band at that time. And under the leadership of Leon Breeden, the program expanded even more because of exposure. Band played the White House a couple of times, did State Department tours, and literally it was the only show in town. I mean, the band would go out and play at Notre Dame Jazz Festival and places like that and blow the other bands off the stage. And it got to the point finally that if North Texas came to a clinic, it was as a non-competitor. If it came to a contest, it was a non-competitor. So literally, it was a groundbreaking program. It's the oldest jazz program in the country. Berkeley at that time was called Schillinger House and hadn't yet turned into Berkeley College of Music. There really wasn't much at all. So just a fortuitous coming together of different elements. Number one, a man who had a vision for the future, and the facilities to put it together and the people to do it with. It's funny. I mean, even Mr. Breeden back in the 60s would get nasty letters saying that he was teaching the music of the devil. Because, I mean, Denton was a little Bible Belt cotton town. And it was amazing that this program was flourishing as it was. And it was really funny. I got to tell one story. When I went as a freshman in 63, another drummer came in as well, and he was from South Carolina. And he showed up. I mean, this guy was a real throwback. He had a wood block and a cowbell and played like the 1920s. He was like a 1920s drummer. And he came in and he sat into with the lab band, and it was pretty funny. And he got very mad because he said, in his southern accent, he said, "Well, I thought this was going to be a dance band." And so the reason why it was called a dance band is because you could not use the word jazz,
Mm.
and because these people who were, fearful that you were bringing the devil to Denton, where you couldn't even get a mixed drink, God forbid. But eventually, then they changed it from dance band to lab band, laboratory band. And then later on, when Denton became more sophisticated, it just came out North Texas Jazz.
Yeah. You've given me a bunch of lucrative directions to go. But I think what I want to push on is the tradition versus modern influences. And you've just alluded to an example where somebody who was very well schooled at a more traditional flavor of jazz, let's say dance band, came and found he was incongruent with the type of music that was happening at North Texas. And I know from some interviews I've listened to that you're an aficionado of Warren Baby Dodds. And the drummer who turned me on to Warren was actually Nasheet Waits. I took a lesson with Nasheet probably 15 years ago, and he was saying you have to check out Warren Dodds, and that sort of buzz roll style New Orleans beat somehow propagated into other things I was doing, and it felt like it made my swing better. But I'm wondering how you balance going really, really deep into the roots of the roots of the roots of the tradition with giving people enough of a kind of crash course on like, okay, here's Philly Joe, here's Elvin, here's Tony. We just need to get these people up to speed so that they can play idiomatic jazz. And do you see those two in conflict? And if so, like how do you balance out the deep tradition with like kind of cutting to the chase with the idioms?
Well, I don't believe in crash courses, first of all, right? Because it's a lifetime journey. You never know it all. There's always new discoveries. Um, my my point of action is to instill a sense of curiosity because that's the teacher. We teach ourselves if we take the responsibility for it. And if I would turn a kid on to Baby Dodds, I'd have some kids who, I shouldn't say kids, young people, but students at a university, freshmen, who were not intrigued by it at all. And invariably, those people were not intrigued because they had no points of relationship with it. Because these were the kind of people who would come in and you'd say, "What? Well, who do you listen to?" When they came in for their auditions, you say, "Who do you listen to?" "Oh man, I listen to," and they reel off the names of who's ever currently on the cover of back then Modern Drummer or whatever. And then you say, "Okay, sit down in here and you like Roy Haynes, right?" "Oh man, I love Haynes. He is so cool. He is so awesome." I say, "Okay, I'm going to put on a track here. I'm just going to put on a bass line and a piano player comping. I want you to play like Roy Haynes." Zero. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. When Weckl was the drum demigod, "Okay, let me hear you do some Weckl." Silent night. Nothing. So then there'd be the people who'd come in and say, "Yeah, man, I'm really into Elvin." And you'd say, "Play something like Elvin." And they would usually say, "Oh, wow. I mean, I could try, but I'll give it a go." And they'll try to do it because they have an aural sense of how he sounds, not just a visual sense of his name. So those people who already have their foot in the door, they're easy to work with. The people who don't have the foot in the door, but who at least exhibit some sort of physical relationship with the instrument, can coordinate well, then it's the big question of saying, are you willing to start here rather than to start here? So that you understand why people play the way they do today. You'll get a better idea if you know where they're coming from. It puts you in the mainstream. So what I tell them is the more you know about the past, the more you're going to understand why the music is played the way it is today, and the better opportunities you'll have for charting your own course.
That's really deep. As you were talking, I was thinking about missing links. Like there are so many connections between one player's playing and another player's playing. Like who was Philly Joe listening to? Who was Max listening to? And listening to Warren, what he's doing with those buzz rolls, it feels like that's what people like Philly Joe and Max adopted and then turned into triplets or sextuplets, right? Like you can kind of hear that lineage.
So that's the press roll and the improvisation. I heard Zudi Singleton solo on Tiger Rag once at Jimmy Ryan's club in New York City. This had to be back in like 1963, 64. No, not then, 67, 68. He took the whole solo just on the snare drum with outlining the melody within the press roll.
Right.
And orchestrating the bass drum. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. And I realized, he just used two parts of the instrument to do what a lot of people use with people that nowadays use, a lot more. But the idea was I heard the ride pattern right there in the press roll.
Yeah.
Obviously, the idea of a sustained legato timeline, accents within the buzz roll. That's obvious that that was the precursor to the ride pattern, where you hit a cymbal, it's a legato sound in which you impose staccato rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
So that connection right there. And I would have my students who, wanted to. I didn't force anybody to do anything. I just give them an F. It's that simple, right? In a school. But I'd say, okay, now start out, and I just say, then move your right hand to the right cymbal. Holy moly, I sound like Jack DeJohnette, whatever. You know what I mean? It's all right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's just so important. The roots of the music, just like, good God, you look at any art form, the people who have excelled in it have an intense knowledge of where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same way with this. When I ran into Max Roach once at the airport in Columbus, Ohio, and I had known him, and we'd actually traveled on a tour together years before. It's been a good 25 or 30 years where we were together for 6 weeks and really, had a chance to hang. So this was 25, 30 years later. I see him in the airport. I walk up and I say, Mr. Roach, I'm Ed Soph. I don't know if you remember me, boom, but strike relationship up. We go sit down, have some coffee. And he says, well, what are you doing in Columbus? He had flown into Columbus from Paris, France, to go to Harry Sweets Edison, the great trumpet player, to go to Sweets' funeral. So he asked me what I'm doing there. And I said, I was here for a week teaching a drum set workshop. And not one to beat around the bush, Max looks at me and says, what are you teaching those kids? Oh, God, help me. So I had my little wallet of CDs with me. I took it out, and first one in there was Baby Dodds. And I gave it to Max, and he took it and looked at it. All he said was, very, very good. I was off the hook. And so, I mean, if you tell a kid that story and what else can you do? You can lead a horse to water. You can't make him drink, and you can't make him thirsty either. It's just, that's the way it is. So, yeah, it's all about curiosity. It's about not being afraid of making mistakes, not being afraid of sounding badly when you first try something new. I had to tell my students, I say, you got to realize that there was a time when Dennis Chambers, Max Roach, on and on, they didn't know which end of the stick to hold. And they're all going through the same journey that you're going through now. So yeah, it's absolutely imperative that one has a vibrant knowledge of the past. And that knowledge grows. I mean, you can never know it all. There's always something more to know. And when I go back and listen to recordings that I listened to when I was 13 and 14 years old, I hear things that I didn't hear back then. So it's not only it's a maturity of listening too. And that's hardly ever mentioned in lessons. The stuff I see on the internet, nobody talks about that. The first step is learning how to listen outside of yourself. And when I was a kid, I had one or two 33 and a third LP records that I played until the grooves were gone. And what was good about this is eventually I quit listening to the drums and started listening to the horn players and listening to the bass player and listening to the piano player. And without knowing it, training myself to listen when I finally actually got on a bandstand and played with people. Yeah. So there's that aspect too. It's fascinating.
One of the first times I met Ari Honig was after a gig in New York in the early 2000s. And I asked him like one of the typical sort of drum student questions, which is like, how many hours a day do you practice? And he was like, yeah, I usually try to practice about 3 hours a day, but I consider listening practice. He's like, some days I might not even touch the drums, but just spend 3 hours listening. So that's super important. The thing about taking the Warren Baby Dodds New Orleans shuffle and moving the right hand to the ride cymbal really, really resonates, because I feel like I had a similar experience when I was working with that stuff. And I wonder if there's a through line to your brush instruction as well, because I think I mentioned when I first reached out that your brush videos were like one of the sort of game changers for me in terms of connecting the dots. And the one of the major things I got from your approach to brushes was the sort of ambidexterity. Like it's not just stirring the pot with one hand and tapping with the other hand, but there's a way that the two hands can move in 3 dimensions that creates legato sounds. And I feel like there's a through line between that sort of phrasing and the role of the right and left hands, and also the Warren Dodds New Orleans vocabulary. And I wonder if you've thought consciously about that, or if you feel like that through line is there, or if I'm way off the res.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. This opens up a lot of doors. First of all, I don't believe in handedness.
Hmm.
I mean, if you saw Oscar Peterson play, or Art Tatum, or Glenn Gould, or Vladimir Horowitz play, could you tell if they were right or left-handed?
No, of course not.
No. Or Giovanni Hidalgo?
No.
No. But drum set? Yeah. And that's largely because of the teaching of drum set. The early days, teaching was largely done in institutions by people who couldn't play the kit. That's why they had to use books. If you can really play the instrument, you don't need to use books. You can use music. So, and it became very codified, as to the point of ding, ding, a ding, ding, a ding, 4 on the floor, the usual stuff, which you even still see today. It's amazing. So, yeah, first of all, I don't believe in handedness, because I have students who have taught themselves to be, whatever you want to call it, can lead with either the left or the right hand.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of doing it. Simon Phillips is a great example of that. But anyway, so the brush technique, quite frankly, the genesis of that idea came from Marty Morell, who's a great drummer who played with Bill Evans, who now lives in Florida and is still with us, fortunately, and still playing. I saw him play and I thought, damn, he's using brushes the way he uses sticks. He's basically playing lateral stickings with the brushes, not just one hand sustaining and one hand accenting. So that was the genesis for what I did with how I played brushes. It was no matter of being original. It was taking a wonderful idea from Marty and then tweaking it for my own uses. But yeah, it's the brushes are the modern version of the press roll in a lot of ways, because of the nature of the instruments, sustained and staccato at the same time. So I basically built my brush technique around the same thing I built my stick technique around, using stickings. So I simply played stickings, but I then developed a catalog, as it were, of different articulations: slaps, pops, taps, sweeps, buzzes, and that sort of thing. So I don't know what else to say about it, other than that's the mundane roots of it are pretty obvious.
This is really fascinating. Hearing you say this, I'm wondering how much of the DNA of your teaching and playing is like in my teaching and playing, because in the same way that you borrowed from Marty Morell, I think maybe it was the early 2010s when I got into your brush stuff, and immediately I felt like this is an approach that feels like it opens up the whole kit. And then later on in my own teaching, I feel like I was reaching for ways to put students in touch with that sensation of the sort of ambidexterity with the brushes, but then transposed to sticks as well. Quick sidebar, when you say you don't believe in handedness, does that mean you would encourage students to practice the Spangalang with both hands? Or is it more like you would? Okay, interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that's the name of the game. Imagination, experimentation.
So one of the biggest paradoxes in music and possibly in art is the idea of a skills hierarchy on the one hand. like something to get good at, the reason why we practice, what it is that we're improving when we shed, versus developing an individual voice. And to some degree, there's no right or wrong if it sounds good. And even you said, don't be afraid to fail. And I feel like it's kind of just this unholy marriage, this like suspension, like oil and vinegar salad dressing. Like you shake it up and it's there, but it's gonna fall apart again. And like North Texas and Berkeley and Interlochen, where I went to music school, are places that really lean into the hierarchies. Like North Texas with the lab bands, like there's the 1 o'clock, the 2 o'clock, the 3 o'clock, etc. Interlochen had like very, very regimented seating where you could challenge somebody for their chair. And I guess where this cashes out in a question is how do you how would you help a student navigate those waters where it's important to be challenged. It's important to see someone better than you and get inspired by that and channel that into shedding harder. But at the same time, you have to hollow out this little place in the storm to find your own voice and be confident being your vulnerable human self in public. How would you reconcile those? Does that spur any thoughts?
Yeah. First of all, developing one's voice. As soon as you pick up a pair of sticks, you have a voice, but it's a mama daddy. Uh, and to have a voice, to develop one's own voice, one must have his or her own brain. It has nothing to do with the hands or the feet, obviously. You play the way you think, play the way you hear. Hearing is a form of thinking. So I would simply tell my students that the last thing you have to worry about is developing a voice. That's a bunch of BS as far as I'm concerned. That's a distraction. And it's an unrealistic burden placed upon one's shoulders. Oh man, I got to develop my own voice. Oh, all you need to do, man, is listen to the music and assimilate. And you're going to have a voice. Just like as an individual, you have your own voice, but you probably have some of your father's or mother's mannerisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an evolutionary process. So having one's voice, that's a distraction from the reality of what we really want to do. And what we really want to do is not have our own voice, but be able to have a voice that allows us to interact in a musical way with other people. That means listening. That means not being afraid of making mistakes. That means being able to trust other people, the people that you're playing with, who are there to play with you, not against you, et cetera, et cetera. Developing one's voice puts it into the world of psychology. Forget it. It's about music. The real world, hierarchies, whether it's a beehive, an anthill, or a music school, there are hierarchies. There's just no way around it. Some of them are good, some of them aren't good. Oligarchies aren't good. All right. But what I would tell my students at North Texas, and I think it's a truism, I told them, number one, if you play with the best instrumentalists at this school, you're going to do the same when you get out of school. If you play with mediocre players, and that's not a bad word, that's a real word. If you play with mediocre players who play well but don't have whatever that thing is that turns you into a Keith Carlock or a Ari Honig or a Blair Cinta, well then be content with that. Or what I'd say, I have more students who don't play drums now for a living, who play them for fun and fulfillment, who are real estate agents, doctors, lawyers, you name it. So, but as a player, if you're not in the upper echelon at school, you're not going to be in the upper echelon when you get out of school. And that getting out of school is the other thing. I'd say, if you're not going to Dallas and not going to Fort Worth and going to jam sessions, which they have at clubs there, if you're not getting out of, the ivory tower here and going into the real world to see how well your skills fit in, well, then you're missing out. Because if you corner the market and are an in-demand musician outside of academia, you're going to be able to do the same in any city. It's all the same, because university is just a microcosm of what you're going to have when you go and get out. The big difference between my generation and the generation now is that these kids don't seem to want to get out of school. You know, they graduate from get a BA at North Texas, and immediately, boom, I'm going to the new school. I'm going to Juilliard. I'm going. Well, that's great that you got in, but you know, people are still going to say, yeah, he's a good little drummer. You're still a student. And this is not casting a fault on the students at all. It's the way the world is. When I graduated, my generation graduated, we went on a road band and broke in like that. That's not available anymore. The closest thing to it is a cruise ship, God forbid. So, but the kids are feel compelled to jump from one nest right into the other. Some of them not that way, you know? But I mean, good Lord, if I were at this day and age, if I were in school, last thing I would want to do would be to go back to continue my schooling. And I would tell my students, get some real world experience. I'm sorry, Juilliard's a great music school, but it's not the real world. And on top of that, from what I've been told, Juilliard has a restriction where you can't take gigs outside of the school. The only gigs you can take are the gigs that are booked through the school. Yeah, you can check on that, but that's what I've been told from a number of people. So, and it's the same way with the classical players at school, at Juilliard. So, I mean, wait a minute now, you know. So that's another observation about the hierarchy. You know, there's an educational hierarchy, and then there's a real world hierarchy too. Mm-hmm. And it's schools do a lot of disservice to a lot of students. Have gone to clinics or done clinics at universities where I see these little signs that say everybody's a first chair player. And I said, wait a minute. Tell that to the New York Philharmonic. Tell that to jazz at Lincoln Center. You know, that's a disservice done to these kids. It's not the real world. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are my insights into it.
That's great. Yeah, that sheds a lot of light on things I think about and things I talk about with my students too. Apropos of this nature nurture thing, like some people, if you don't have it in music school, you're never going to have it. Maybe that extra edge, that extra 1% that makes the once in a generation players. How do you tell if you just don't have it yet? If you just haven't put in enough time, if you're just proto having enough hours, or if you're never going to have it?
Are you talking about as a student knowing himself or herself, or the teacher's observation?
I suppose I would ask from your perspective as a teacher.
Okay.
Like if a student asks you that question and you're thinking back through all the instances you've seen over the years, how do you think you'd answer that?
Well, I learned a long time ago not to tell a student that they'll never make it. I think that's the height of egotism for a teacher, because there's all sorts of things. I was known as Darth Vader at school. I was a very tough teacher. If somebody sounded bad, didn't practice, I kicked them out of the lesson and read them the riot act. Mm-hmm. Because that's how I was taught. If you're not serious, get out of the program. Mm-hmm. Period. And my idea was, well, first of all, I'd have students who would come from small music programs at small high schools in rural Iowa or someplace. That's not a put down. That's just what it was. And come to school and be completely overwhelmed. Hear drummers that they had no idea could play like that, who were their peers. And I would tell them, you know, no, I wouldn't say, yeah, man, you're never going to make it. No, you can't cut it. I'd say, you might consider looking into going to a smaller program. where
Mhm.
the competition is perhaps not quite so as intense. And I've had told a number of students to do that, and they've done it, and they've done very well. They have careers.
Mhm.
The other aspect that one teaches is just what sort of chemistry is between the teacher and the student. Some people just can't get along. As hard as you try, there can be blockades, which as hard as you try to break them down, it just doesn't happen. So I've told students, I'd say, look, man, if we were married, this would be misery. And they'd laugh and say, yeah, yeah, it would, wouldn't it? So I say, I think you might want to look around and find a teacher who you feel more comfortable with. Like I said, because I'll give an inch, but I won't give a mile. I mean, I have my standards, and I expect you to at least try to match them in your own approach. And if it didn't work, okay, fine, that's good. So with those two factors out of the way, then the third one is, well, how to put this? I at one time was dead intent on creating the greatest drummers in the world. All my students were going to be the best. They're going to be all top echelon. And I realized, boy, Soph, that's the old ego taking over again. So, rethinking that, I told my students that my job was to hopefully make them realize whatever potential they had as a player within the environment of the school, with the intent of having good enough skills that would help them gain entry into musical situations outside of the school, realize their potential. And I left it at that. Now, if somebody didn't work, if someone would come into if somebody came to my lesson and tried to bullshit me, I mean, I can tell within 2 notes whether somebody's practiced. And they try to bullshit me. If they're dishonest, I just flat out tell them, man, if this is how you deal with people and with yourself, you better get a desk job someplace where somebody tells you what to do. Forget it. Forget it. Bullshit will get you nowhere. And those are the people that I say, your future's blanked if this is how you treat something that you're supposedly studying for a career. So that's the only point. If a person works, if they come into their lesson with questions, if they come into their lesson and say, Ed, you said this, but it works better for me this way. Yeah, baby. That's it. Because my job, if you want to boil it down to as simplistic as possible, is to get people to think for themselves. Because that's what all the great players do, is that they all have their own way of thinking about music and how they want to play it through the drums.
And it sounds like, from what I've heard you say in other interviews, you would have some students who just sort of got it soup to nuts, who just sort of understood what they needed to do work ethic wise and enthusiasm wise from top to bottom, who kind of came in already enthusiastic, and you didn't have to get them excited about checking out a great player or something like that. But then there was another category of people for whom it was a little bit like Last Chance U. I don't know if you've seen that show. It's a Netflix show about like football players who wash out of like AAA programs, and like there are these coaches who have these talented students but who have like problematic lives or whatever, and they're trying to get them motivated. They're like, the underlying talent is there, but this is your one shot to like learn how motivated you need to be and how hard you need to work. Otherwise, it's probably not a football career for you. And it sounds like, from talking to different teachers, they have different approaches to this. Some people are just like, yep, if they don't have it, it's not my job. But it sounds like you really took ownership of at least giving it that that last ditch try to spark something and show people, even if they didn't walk in the door with that motivation, like this is the level, this is the work ethic that's required, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. That's something as mundane as time management skills. Another thing that's often overlooked because we get so tied up in the minutia of what we're doing is that so many young people don't know how to practice.
Hmm.
They have no idea. I ask a student, have you ever timed yourself when you practice? Say if you're working on hand exercises like stick control. George Stone at the bottom of that page says play each exercise, what is it, 50 times? You know, if I had $1 for everybody who's played it 50 times, I wouldn't have very many dollars.
I would flunk this test, by the way. I'm starting to flat sweat here.
Yeah, have you ever practiced one exercise for 5 minutes so that you've given yourself to immerse yourself into that, to feel what you're doing, to listen to what you're doing? Some people want to take it to, hey, baby, I'm meditating and all that kind of stuff. No, it's just a matter of really focusing and thinking about what you're doing. And from my own experience, I mean, I'd breeze through something and go, but wait a minute, I'm not thinking. I'm just going through the motions here. What can I do with this dynamically? What about if I add some accents to it? How slowly can I play it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by, spending some time with that one little exercise, you suddenly plug into all these other aspects, musical aspects that you then can apply to everything else that you do. So kids don't know about that. They treat practicing the same way they treat classroom hours. Bang, the bell rung, it's over. And they don't realize that what practicing entails, that it means having the patience. Bingo, big word. Very hard for people nowadays because everything comes at us so quickly. Don't have to wait for anything. It's there. And they come in with that mentality and say, wait a minute. You can't Google musicality, pal. You've got to spend some time with it. And then basically what I would do is I'd say, okay, we're going to play quarter notes. And I'm going to put the clock here and we're going to do it for 10 minutes. And I want you to figure out how many ways you can play quarter notes in those 10 minutes. They look at me like I'm completely nuts. But then they start to go, ooh, I can play them on the hoops. I can play them near the edge on the head. I can play on the middle of the head. I can play one hand, cross stick, and I can play, boom, the whole world opens up. It's like Joey Barron, great drummer. Joey Barron says, I'm taking some time off and reacquainting myself with the quarter note. But how to practice? Weckl, when he was in Connecticut, practiced on the average of 8 hours a day. I can't practice 8 hours a day. First of all, I'd be divorced. And secondly, I'd just be, forget it. But there are people who can do that. There are other people who can practice for 2 hours and because of their abilities, mental abilities, can get a great deal out of just those 2 concentrated hours. So the only thing I would tell my guys is it's not about how long you do it, it's how well you do it. And if your practice session ends with you realizing other things that you can practice in relation to this exercise, then that's progress. And progress never means completing. It means simply doing. Just doing it. Because once you reach your goal, you're going to realize that there's another goal above that, another goal there, another goal there. But to emphasize it, so many of these young folks coming into school did not have a clue as to how to practice musically, how to practice creatively, et cetera, et cetera. I said, you want to practice the way you want to play. Of course, if they don't know how they want to play, well, that opens up another door into another exploration. But the more basic it becomes, the deeper it gets. And that's what you go for. Peel all the layers away till you get down to, oh well, no wonder you're this is giving you trouble. You don't know how to practice it. You don't know how to say. Have you ever taken piano lessons? Yeah. Well, if you're doing a Bach two-part invention, do you learn both hands together at the same immediately? Oh no, man, you take each. Well, it's the same way with the drums. If you've got four parts happening, take them apart. You'd be surprised at how many people have never done that. You can't assume
Yeah.
anything. The most basic things more than likely have been overlooked because what draws guys to the drums? Somebody playing quarter notes slowly and gracefully? Hell no. Somebody going, yeah.
True. But then people see Brian Blade and wonder why he sounds magical even when he's playing the simplest thing. And this is something I was talking with John Riley about too, where if there's kind of a tough lesson for a student and they're not absorbing it, like sometimes finding a side door into the concept is helpful, where it's like Mr. Soph, I don't understand why I have to just spend 25 minutes playing quarter notes. And then you can be like, well, here's Roy Haynes. Like, come back next week and do that. Make your ride cymbal sound like his. And then when inevitably it doesn't, you can be like, well, that's why we need to practice quarter notes.
Well, the thing that I would often do is I'm very good. If I have one great skill, really good skill, I'm really good at imitating young drummers because at one time I sounded just the way they do. And I do drummer number one and drummer number two when we're talking about, and it can be done with anything. It can be done with quarter notes, basic timekeeping, you name it. But I'll play it the way they were playing it. And then I'll play it the way I feel I would play it in a more musical manner. Quite frankly, better than they did. All right. And if I couldn't do that, I'd really be in trouble. And then I'd say, okay, which drummer did you think sounded better? Which drummer sounded better? Oh, wow. Drummer number two. And I said, well, who drummer number one sound like? And they get this sheepish look on their face and go, me. Boy, that's it. The door's open right there. Self-awareness. That's the other thing. Not only curiosity, no fear of mistakes, but self-awareness. These people don't know how they sound until they're shown how they sound. Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Soph, why do you sound better than I do? Why would you get the gig and I wouldn't? And I'd say, well, because I practiced stuff like this when I played like you did. And that works. That works. Rather than, I could send them to Roy Haynes or Philly Joe, but not yet. Not yet. In all my years of teaching at North Texas, the 30 years that I was there as drummer number one and drummer number two, I only had one guy who liked the way he played better than the way I played.
Just someone I would know.
Jeff Bezos. No, just kidding. So yeah, drummer number one, drummer number two is invaluable, I think. Yeah, because it really brings it home. But makes a student really starts to generate self-awareness in the student.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. One other thing I've been really interested in lately, particularly with jazz, is the gap between learning rudiments or learning transcriptions or practicing sort of prescriptive things like an exercise, and then having that through line into improvisation. And one of the most common things people who come to me tell me they're struggling with is that they'll practice all this stuff in the shed and then they'll go to improvise and it's like they didn't practice anything. Nothing's coming through in their playing. Is this something that was a challenge for your students, and if so, what are your favorite, or what are and were your favorite ways of handling that?
Well, each student's a different approach usually, and I don't use a cookie cutter approach. Everybody gets the same basic tools, but they're presented in different ways. There's so much that goes into teaching. I mean, if a student's shy, students overbearing. I mean, a good teacher is obviously also sort of an amateur psychologist. So different ways of approach, no cookie cutter approach. Um, so what I do now, what I've done more and more, I learned rudiments when I was a kid, when I first started one surface learning, but it was taught rudiments taught in a very musical way, not in a mechanical way, as it's sometimes done, especially if a person is in a drum line, drum corps, unless it's a molar drum corps. Um, but I was taught in the method with like Wilcoxon and Gadd the same way, coming out of Wilcoxon, but swinging Wilcoxon, playing it with a groove, um, and with rebound sticking in the whole thing. At any rate, and I think that's very important. And I do get into stickings with my students, but not until they try to play melodies, because you can't play flowing melodies unless you know flowing stickings with which to articulate them. So the first thing that a student has to be able to do is to be able to vocalize what they want to play. So if you took a tune like Confirmation and they go ta 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 ta, that's what's going to come out. But if you say ube slabba ugadigu blada digadu blap blap, aha, there's your voice right there. The voice is the voice. So, and I learned this from the older players that I played with in New York, like Clark Terry, those guys. They could vocalize everything. It all came from the voice. So I use the melody as the vehicle for entrance into the stickings, into the exercises. I don't do it the other way around. I would not impose that on anybody just to practice stickings. That's like saying somebody, you're going to learn improvisation, but all you can do for the first 2 years is play scales. No thanks. No thanks. You learn the mechanics by trying to play music and use that as the bridge into stickings, stroke types, etc., the nuts and bolts. And that way, that in combination with one's own inner interpretation of the melody. I mean, that's it right there for me. And this is nothing original. I mean, it was a great drum set teacher, great person, great cat, who unfortunately left us much too early, Bob Galati, who taught at Berkeley. Oh, man. Bob used the Charlie Parker fake book as a drum method. That's where he came from. If you want to learn this vocabulary, you don't play paradiddles, unless the paradiddle relates to the melodic contour that you want to play. Oh, it makes so much sense. Treats the drums in such a musical way. So I use, it's just, I mean, it goes on and on and on, because it just opens so many doors when you work on something that's as personal as one's own interpretation of a melody. It's so much different than one's own interpretation of a paradiddle. You know what I mean? And oh God, it just opens up the door for discovery, for everything. Grips, where you hold the stick, how you hold the stick. It's nuts. I mean, it's no ending. That's why I find teaching is so invigorating, is because there's so many doors to go through. And it's like playing. The teaching becomes just as creative. I hate to use that word, or improvisatory is a better word. Your teaching should be just as improvisatory as the music that you're teaching. And Alan Dawson the same way. God, he was another great teacher. What did he do? He played vibes and had the students play with it. Oh man, brilliant, brilliant. So yeah, that's uh, that's how I bring rudiments in. And then I also show I've got some sheets that Philly Joe wrote out, lesson sheets that Philly Joe wrote. And it's all about Wilcoxon, lesson
Mm.
25 and all that stuff. And it's obvious that Philly Joe's soloing and very rudimentally based. But fine. Just because you learn a paradiddle doesn't mean you're going to sound like Philly Joe Jones. Got to examine the musical elements, how he interpreted music. Do that, you use music.
Yeah. Yeah, this really resonates among other reasons because recently I was using sort of the canon of Philly Joe and Max to teach students, and it worked really well if they had a lot of exposure to jazz before that, if they kind of had an idea how jazz musicians phrase. But if they hadn't, like I had some students who were very good players coming from pop or rock, there was there was something missing, and that was just that lexicon. It's like they'd never heard a musical conversation in that idiom. So we had to do a lot of work to kind of incept them with the type of things, the sort of musical words, phrases, and sentences in the jazz lexicon, so that those things would become second nature. It's almost like learning a bunch of vocabulary words and then not having anything to say with them, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm categorized as quote a jazz teacher, but I'm not a jazz teacher. I'm an improvisation teacher. And what I
Hmm.
do with jazz, I'd also do with funk. I mean, if the kids didn't know about Jabo Starks and Clyde Stubblefield and those folks, I would turn them on to that. Bernard Purdy. Bernard Purdy. Oh my God. You know, just checking that stuff out. The baby Dodds is of that style too. And their improvisatory ability. I had my, as you realize one of the joys of getting older is you realize how stupid you are. When I did a jazz festival one year, and the other house drummer was Purdy, and I mean I absolutely am and was and am in awe of the man. But I was really amazed because I'm thinking, damn, this is a jazz festival. I guess he's going to do some funk stuff. Oh boy, this guy played bebop. It would, scare you to death.
Hmm.
Just, and I realized all these guys, they can do whatever they have to do. They can do it all. So he's the only reason the only thing that gave Purdy away when he played bebop is when he traded fours and eights and stuff. He'd throw in the hi hat barks, but otherwise, oh my God! And I felt like such an idiot. No wonder he's such a great funk player. He's a great jazz player. He's a great improviser. And this is obviously true of most players. They're categorized by the media, by the manufacturers, or whatever as a one groove sort of guy. But it's like Danny Sewell, the great Los Angeles drummer who played with Paul McCartney's Wings for years. I saw him in a club playing brushes, and I almost dropped my teeth. I mean, it was just beautiful. I'm again, Soph, wake up, you idiot. These guys are good at whatever they do. Jim Keltner, the same thing. J.R. Robinson,
Hmm.
hear him play big band at the Grammys? Holy God. You know, these guys are
Yeah.
good at it all. And that's one of the advantages of the North Texas program is it covers that kind of spread, that kind of breadth. It's not the style du jour. This is what's in style today, so we'll just teach that. It's the whole ball of wax. They learned how
Amazing.
to improvise. Keith Carlock is a great improviser. That's why he's got the gig with Steely Dan.
It feels like players from North Texas have maybe more versatility than players from strictly jazz schools. So I want to.
This day and age, especially, versatility to me would be an absolute necessity. I've got some guys who play Broadway too, very successful on Broadway. So why? Because they can improvise. They can listen. Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing. I really, really appreciate your time. Final question: if you could leave like the up and coming drummers of today with like a single thought or a single adage, something you think that maybe doesn't get said enough, what would you say?
Find a teacher who challenges. Find a teacher who
Amazing.
tells you if you sound bad, you sound bad.
Mm.
Find a teacher who will tell you if you sound great, will tell you well, you sound great. If he tells you you sound bad, he will then tell you why and show you why you sound bad.
Be afraid to receive bad news, or be unafraid to receive bad news. Yeah.
I say this because when I was first starting out, I taught at music schools or music shops. And one of the things that I was told to do was to make sure that the kid buys a drum set. And I couldn't do that. It just wasn't
Mm.
right. And then I realized that there are a lot of guys who are in a position where they can't tell a student he sounds bad
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason. And I sympathize with that entirely. But even in a situation like that, where student retention for one reason or another is an absolute necessity, that at least you still have the obligation to, in a positive way, tell that student how he can sound better without saying to him, "You stink, man. You really sound bad." No, you say, "Hey, you sound pretty good. But let's see if we can make it sound even better."
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you want to do. Is There's many ways of nurturing a student without discouraging them or without misleading them.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for all these good interviews that you're doing. I learned from all of them.
Oh, you're too kind.
No, I'm not. I'm honest. That's all.
Well, thanks. I'll let you know before we post it, but yeah, really, really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, I hope we get to meet in person one of these days.
Me too. I hope we make it happen. Take care.